What's up, team? Sean from Vesta Live here, and we've got some great news coming out of Palantir. We just saw that yesterday was announced that a 10-year deal was signed between the Cleveland Clinic and Palantir to help provide a virtual command center to better handle patient flow. Now, on the surface, 10-year deal sounds great. We don't know exactly how much it's for, but it's still an exciting deal. What I really want to stress here is that it's not the deal that's important. It's not the 10 years that's important. It's not eventually the size of the deal that's important. Those are all important things in theory, but we're not talking about stock price. We're talking about the size of the market within healthcare, within the medical space, within the patient flow space. Because to date, folks have barely scratched the surface as far as what patient flow can actually mean in terms of efficacy, in terms of efficiency, in terms of overall revenue, in terms of healthcare, in terms of keeping people safe and healthy and staffing properly. This is a bigger picture than you're going to think from the surface. Okay. So, what I wanted to start with was really simple. The deal itself is, as I just described, it's a 10-year partnership that's going to optimize patient flows for Cleveland Clinic by leveraging Palantir's virtual command center. But if you're like anyone out there, you might be saying to yourself, well, cool, what is a patient flow? And if you've never heard this term before, it might seem like pretty obvious, but I want to call this out for a second. Patient flow in its most simple description is really how we think about the movement of patients through the facility. Oftentimes in many businesses, we'll call it like the life cycle of a customer or a client. In this case, we're talking about the patient, right? So we're looking at from the time that they're essentially walking through those doors, whether it's delivery by an ambulance or not, how they're treated, triaged, moved into treatment, put into a bed, sent home, monitored after the fact, whatever it might be. And we typically think about this in terms of involving the overall medical care, any physical resources that go into that process, and then overall the internal systems that help to get patients from one system to the next to the next. Okay. So that's the patient flow movement in general. Now, I want to pause here for a second because I think it's important to understand that this is more than it sounds like. There are countless companies that work in this space who really focus on, the data side of it, the software side of it, the hardware side of it, the machinery side of it, the staffing side of it, the licensing side of it, the compliance side of it. Okay. There's a lot of pieces of data. There's a lot of solutions working within this space. And this has led to a fairly large industry that's growing really well. I'm going to talk about that in a second as well. But I want you to really understand why it's so important that we have the ability to look at data in a big way here. Something just happened with my camera. I hope it didn't disrupt the recording here. But in essence, what we're looking at is we have to ensure that patients are both treated properly and with care from the moment they come in to the moment they leave in an efficient process, because at the end of the day, a hospital is still a business. We also want to make sure that we have an understanding of the data, where it sits, how it's tracked back to the person, how we learn from that as far as how long they're there, how efficient the process was, the degree of efficacy, which is essentially saying when we do treat them, does it really solve the problem? Does it lead to getting them back on their feet faster or not faster? And then there's also considerations in and around master data management, or what we'll often call MDM. There's a lot of major players in the MDM space, which provides a ton of data that can be used. And I think to date, the problem has been no one's really had a powerful enough solution at scale on the operational side to really start pulling and teasing out the insights from those little bits of data. Now, to be clear too, because I think it's important you understand the full picture here, MDM is really what we often call the golden record in healthcare. This means that I am me, no matter what happens from the time I check in to the time that I check out and everything in between. The reason this is important is because when you're checking in, you might say your first name, your last name, but you forget your middle initial. When you get checked in from the bed, you might include your middle initial, but they might have misunderstood an address, or maybe they have an old address and they forgot to ask. Or you could have said the phone number with one digit off because you were in pain or you weren't thinking about it. Then when you check out, yada, yada, yada. You see where I'm going with this, right? Just in one visit, there's many different areas where you could slightly create confusion within the data. So having the ability to roll all that up into one unified picture is really important. So that's why I'm saying there was a lot of data already there. There's a lot of folks already working within that space. Excuse me. So that's the idea of really patient flow. Now, what I really want to add to this as well is there are a number of players who are working in different areas and components within the global patient flow solution market. Okay. And in theory, as it stands right now, this is a market that should grow in the next few years to somewhere around 4.2 billion. Okay. And this is growing at, give or take, and I think you can look at this in a number of different places, but we have a CAGR of anywhere between like 18.5 to 19.5 over the next several years. So it's double-digit growth from a CAGR perspective. It's an industry where we haven't quite completely solved for it, where we're really, really focused on optimization in terms of data, in terms of analytics, in terms of even AI. And I'm going to talk about some failures in a second as well. And then I'm going to wrap this all up into why I'm so excited in it. I think a big part of it is really understanding that the reason we're getting to these 4.2 plus billion with these double-digit CAGRs is because there's so many people who are so focused on these slices within this market. Okay. It is very competitive if you approach it from a point of solution perspective. And you also have to think about in terms of patient flow as how you segment and break down the individual components and pieces of it. Okay. So as an example, you might think about it from like a product perspective, right? We've got fully integrated solutions that are in the hospital trying to look at everything. And you've got sort of standalone singular solutions. Maybe it's a solution just for admissions or just for managing beds or just for staffing or just for exit admissions. Okay. We also think about it from the standpoint of the components that are involved, right? We've got a lot of hardware, think data systems and data storage. We've got machines, we've got IoT hooked up to them. Perhaps we're looking at it from a software perspective, all the different MDM systems, the databases, the warehouses, all of the solutions that sit on top of those from a software perspective. And then, of course, we have the services, professional services, consulting, et cetera. All of that goes into this as well when we think about it from a component perspective. Now, take it even a step further, patient flows can segment themselves into a true like web-based, cloud-based modern infrastructure. But a lot of hospitals, a lot of clinics, a lot of these types of healthcare facilities are still operating on what we call on-prem technology. So think the big old server looks like a big closet. They're storing the data in-house. It's not leaving to a cloud. That's on-prem. So that's still wildly popular within this segment as well. And then you can even think about it in terms of who's ultimately getting to this from an end user perspective, right? It's easy when you hear a name like Cleveland Clinic. It's a gigantic clinic, right? For academia, for treating patients, but it's hospitals, it's clinics, it's the small local doctors' offices. There's lots of different little components as far as the end user and where that's going to be delivered. And then, of course, I know this is going to be an obvious one, but I want to call it out anyways. Also thinking about it in terms of geography, right? We might be very focused just in the US, but then the expansionary perspective is, well, what's happening in Canada? What's happening in Mexico? Leave North America and start to concentrically look bigger and wider. And the market continues to change because healthcare is not healthcare everywhere you go. So it becomes even more important to understand rules, laws, regulations, treatment cycles, how hospitals work efficiently and efficacy within those different areas, what you're faced from a challenge perspective in terms of staffing, qualified support, access to materials, access to medicine, access to beds. You see where I'm going with this, right? There is an absolute mountain, boatload, ton, humongous amount of data. And you know what? People have tried to solve for this. So I think for folks who watch this channel, you know, my background has, for the better part of 20 years, really been in integrated operational focused AI, right? However, I did spend quite a bit of time in my years at IBM working within health and life sciences. So I have a particular fondness for this industry and the way we think about the data. That's why I tend to really be able to talk about this. So we saw, as an example, that IBM went all in. They went all in on Watson Health. Watson was really designed to be sort of, I think, where Palantir is today. The idea was that it would ingest, understand, and deliver tons of great insights about the data it was collecting in usable terminology. And the theory behind it was that even with the complexity of patient data, medical data, illness data, right, et cetera, it would be able to take that and work with it. The problem was it wasn't quite ready. It was just a little too complex. And I'm going to speak to why I get excited when I hear about Palantir doing this versus other companies. So IBM spent all this money, and essentially the problem was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the areas where it could have been good, there just wasn't enough data to be good. And the recommendations it was making were far too generic, far too obvious, not worth the money it would take to do it. Now, on the flip side, the complexity of some of the data, on the other hand, was that it couldn't quite figure out from one case to the other what the right recommendation was. And we saw this sort of time and time again where, excuse me, once they started auditing the results of those recommendations, overall, a lot of hospitals said, you know what, this just isn't going to work. Now, the beauty of this was to say the idea was right, trying to execute it on it was wrong. The data was there, but the complexity was really high. Now, I want to bring you all back to something that was said the other day from Karp himself, and he said, "Look, they're not trying to solve for sales, service. They're not trying to be the front end AI or prediction engine, right? They really want to be the back end, the operational component of this." So when you think about a deal working with patient flows, this is huge because patient flows is purely operational. It is going to definitely have an impact on efficiency and efficacy in and around billing, admissions, beds, staffing, treatments, that clean flow through the process. Because let's call it what it is. People who are admitted to the hospital are not there by choice, right? Something has happened. It's forced them to have to go there. They don't want to sit in the waiting room for 3 hours. They don't want to be sitting in a bed with no one treating them. They don't want to be there longer than they have to be. They just want to be better and get better. This means knowing and having the right people there to treat problems as they arise. Now, a great example that was shared when the story broke was it's very easy to predict someone coming in for an arthroscopic surgery on their knee. You can schedule that months out in advance. But what happens when you're thinking about the emergency room and you don't know what's going to come in from night to night? You don't know how many nurses you should have, how many doctors you should have on staff. You don't know how many beds you might need that night. Well, the truth is, you can do a lot of this. You just need to functionally be able to take all of that data. You need to run it through the system, and you need to start coming up with a recommendation engine that will let you apply likelihood or propensity to the questions you're asking. And those questions will start to drive and work with maybe the staffing component, just as an easy example. Now, the key to any good AI system is it's going to be self-auditing. So what this means is that at first, it might not be super statistically relevant. And this is, again, why the 10-year piece is particularly interesting here. You don't take on projects like this for a year and say, we'll see how it goes. This is a big project. This is bigger than I think folks are going to look at it on the surface level. It requires a decade of interactions, of self-auditing, of learning, of truly looking at the machine learning aspect of this to be able to start to learn, well, look, when do we see bumps in time, right? When is the emergency room the busiest? And you might say to yourself, well, come on, we can do that now. I could throw that in a spreadsheet. I could just sort by busiest times, and there's a basic model, 100%. But it's the specialization, it's the operational efficiencies that you don't get from doing that, right? What you don't want is to have doctors and nurses who are already exhausted sitting around with nothing to do and then suddenly get slammed, and that's when they're understaffed. So you want to really have the ability to work with and get recommendations from it that over time will continue to learn. I'll give you a great example of what this means. It might on the first turnaround say, hey, look, most of our problems happen between the hours of 4 and 6. That's rush hour. There's lots of cars on the road, so there's accidents. Okay. And from there, the big piece of it is going to be, okay, so we think there's going to be accidents. This means trauma. We want to have trauma surgeons in the emergency room. Okay. But we want to know two things. Well, let's say we follow the recommendation. How did that change the outcomes of efficiency and efficacy? And let's say we don't follow the recommendations. How does that change those components? And this is sort of the process of starting to take one step at a time, and building statistical relevance in the model that you're working on. I could talk all day about this. I literally do this all day for a living, so I happen to really love this topic. But I think the key takeaway here is, and I want you to start getting your arms around this, if you solve it here, you can solve it anywhere. Any hospital system that has an emergency room, I'm just using the emergency room as an example because it's so easy to talk through. Anyone with an emergency room needs to think about staffing, efficiency, and operational efficacy. It has to happen. The margins need to be maintained for these businesses. They are very unpredictable. So the more predictable you make it, the more valuable your solution is. And the more valuable your solution is, the more, the more ROI you're returning. ROI makes it easier to sell. Those sales start to grow. The long tail of all this process is, hopefully for those who are watching this about the stock, you see some gain in the stock price, you see revenues go up, you see better things happening. I want to just finish with a statement here because I think it's really important. it's very easy to say, well, why won't this happen to them the same way it happened to IBM Watson for healthcare? And I'm going to tell you why. Watson for healthcare was very focused on extremely complex problems right out of the gate. Now, that made for good news stories. It sounded really cool, but the problem is it could take 20 years to solve for major diseases. It could take a very long time to see any kind of financial return from it. Now, as a human being, I don't care if it takes 100 years. We want to cure things and figure things out and make life better. But as a for-profit company, we also have to have revenue generation. We have to have success and measurable metrics. And I think that by taking on a project like this over a 10-year period where you can have measured results tied to things like staffing dollars, margin costs, right? Those are things you can really tie back to a price point and then deliver the value and the ROI on that, right? If you're saying to someone, hey, I can, get you a 10% return, it's not worth it. But if you can 3x the return, everyone's going to say yes to that. So as much as this is an experiment for them to be a partner on, it's also a marketing story in the making. So I feel like I could go on for another 2 hours. And what I'll say is this: please drop a comment below if you have questions or want a deeper answer or something like that. And I'm happy to answer it. I just don't want to take this for another 60 minutes of me talking in diatribes about all the different interesting points, things that can happen here. But I think the biggest takeaway for me is not looking at this as an impact on the stock price, but on the overall technology and delivery of that technology. These are the kind of things that build the foundation you build a gigantic company on. So, team, that's it. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please hit that like button. I really appreciate it. Otherwise, good luck today. Have a great day. Have a good week. Be careful in the markets, and I hope all is well. Talk to you soon.